Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about Stephen King. We're going to be talking about Stephen King today, an author I've come to really enjoy for the most part. Stephen King, I've given him some trouble in the past because he can be inconsistent, but for the most part, I really enjoy Stephen King's books. And I am reading every book written by Stephen King in publication order. And I'm doing this because when I started my channel, what was it, 3 years ago? I can't remember. It's been a while. It's been a while since I started my channel, maybe 2.5 years. Something I have to check. Anyway, early on, I came up with this idea, a read every book by challenge, where I asked my viewers for some suggestions for some authors, and I would put all the authors on a wheel, and whoever won the spin, I would read every book written by that author. And Stephen King was on that list, and Stephen King won, much to my horror. Because, Stephen King has written a gazillion books. It isn't a gazillion. I don't know how many. My math isn't that good. But he has a lot of books out there, and he keeps writing more. How am I ever supposed to finish this challenge if he keeps writing more books? I don't know. So I've been slowly reading every book written by Stephen King in publication order. It's taken some time because I'm reading a bunch of other stuff at the same time, and I'm also doing the same thing basically with Edgar Rice Burroughs. So it's been kind of a long process. There were like 6 months where I didn't read Stephen King at all. But this year, 2024, I'm going to really concentrate more on continuing this challenge. So I've read every single Stephen King book published in the 1970s, with the exceptions of the books written under the name Richard Bachman, and we'll get to that. But every book that was written under Stephen King's name, published in the 1970s, I've read up until, I think, 1984. I think that's where I'm at now, 1984. And so today I'm going to talk about the next 10 books. The next 10 books from Stephen King that were written by Stephen King that I'm going to read. There is one, however, that I do not have. And the book I do not have, and I can't get it because I'm on the 500 book challenge. And the book I don't have and will not get in time to read it in publication order is a book called Bare Bones, Conversations on Terror, which is a book, I believe, with interviews of Stephen King, and Stephen King talks about, scary stuff and what makes things scary and why he writes scary stuff. I don't know. I'm just guessing. It sounds that way. Bare Bones, Conversations on Terror. I don't have that book. And I believe that book came out in 1988, if I'm remembering right. I will read that book one day. I just have to read a bunch of other books before I can get it. But every other book I think I've got of Stephen King in one form or another. So let's talk about the next 10 books from Stephen King that I'll be reading. So the next one I'll be reading is this one. This is Thinner by Richard Bachman. Richard Bachman, who is really Stephen King. This is the book that outed Stephen King as Richard Bachman. Richard Bachman was Stephen King's pseudonym, and he published some of his earlier novels under this name. And he published this novel, Thinner. And there was some guy out there who read this book and said, "Hey, this sounds exactly like Stephen King. Could it be Stephen King?" This, of course, is who Stephen King was pretending to be, Richard Bachman. But, he did some research, this guy, and it turned out, yeah, Stephen King wrote this book. So this book, originally published by Richard Bachman, was republished as a book by Stephen King, and it sold a whole bunch more copies when it had Stephen King's name on it. I don't think I've ever read this. A lot of the books that I've read for this challenge I have read before, but I read them when I was a teenager. You know, a lot of these books I read in the 80s, maybe a few I read in the 90s, but not too much after that. In this book, I can't remember reading, so I probably haven't read it. I have, I believe, seen the movie, although I don't remember much about the movie either. But this is the next one that I'm going to be reading. This is Thinner by Stephen King pretending to be Richard Bachman. So there's that. And the book following that I'll be reading is Skeleton Crew. This was from a line of Stephen King books where I didn't really care for the covers too much. They're kind of, eh. But, you know, Stephen King's name is what sells these books. So, you know, the covers can sometimes be bland. And this one kind of is. This is Skeleton Crew, and I did read this one, and I remember it fondly, mostly because of The Mist, the novella that is included in this book, which is dynamite from what I remember. And I saw the movie, and if anything, the movie was even better than the novella. But, you know, maybe I'll change my mind because I haven't read this since, what, 1986? When did this book come out? Let's see. Yeah, 1986. It's copyright 85, but I'm sure I read the paperback version in 86. And so I'm looking forward to this. I enjoyed his first collection of short fiction, Night Shift, tremendously. So this has a bunch of his shorter pieces in it. Stephen King's Skeleton Crew. I remember this being good, so I'm looking forward to it. Now, the next book is this book, the Bachman books. Stephen King, outed as Richard Bachman, decided, you know, okay, everybody knows that I wrote these books under the name Richard Bachman. Let's put them all in one big book. There were 4 novels in here, and we'll publish them all as one book. And that's how I originally got a hold of this. Although I never read it. I had an earlier edition of this. I didn't read it. I don't know what happened to that original copy. And then a few years later, I read, it was The Running Man. The Running Man is in this. So there are four short novels in this: Rage, The Long Walk, Road Work, and The Running Man. And the only one I've ever read is The Running Man. And I read that because I got the mass market movie tie-in edition from when Arnold Schwarzenegger made that movie. The movie version of The Running Man, which has nothing to do with the book. I remember reading the book. I don't remember much about it. And then I remember going to see the movie and the movie being completely different. And I didn't think the movie was all that great from what I remember. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but I don't remember too much about the book or the movie. And the other books I've never read. Now, the first book is completely unavailable now. The book called Rage. There's a reproduction of the cover, which is about this psycho kid who I believe goes into a classroom and kills his teacher and holds the children hostage or something like that. Now, considering how things have gone in our stupid world, it's not surprising that Stephen King doesn't want this novel on the market anymore. I think he feels like, you know, do I really need to have that book out there with my name on it? From what I've heard, it's not that great of a book anyway. I understand why Stephen King wouldn't want it out there, but I'm glad I've got it because I do want to read it. I want to read this whole thing, the Bachman books. And so this is where I'm going to read them which is at the point that they were published as Stephen King books written by Stephen King, and everybody knew it. So yeah, the Bachman books. And that is followed by Stephen King's epic, which is It. This is It, which I remember reading, and I had issues with it from what I recall. But I know when I read this again, it'll be a very different experience because that's how it's been with every Stephen King book that I've reread. You know, every Stephen King book that I read when I was a teenager or a very young man, and I read them now, usually I enjoy them a lot more now than I did, you know, when I was a bratty kid. I don't know how I'm going to feel about this one, though. not only do I remember this being super long, it is. I remember it not having to be as, it's like this book didn't need to be this long. That's what I remember about it. There was one scene towards the end which is infamous, and I'm sure that'll seem just as bad reading it now as it did the first time I read it, if not worse. But we'll see. I might love this book reading it, a second time. This is one of his most popular books. It might even be his most popular book. No, that's probably The Stand. That's probably The Stand. But I think this one probably comes close. So Stephen King's It, finally going to get to It. So that's kind of exciting. Now that is followed by the sequel to The Gunslinger, and that's going to be this one, The Drawing of the Three. I really enjoyed The Gunslinger. I read that, last year? I can't remember. But I read it for part of this project. And so finally, I get to the sequel, The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. And this is supposed to be fantastic. I don't know if it's really fantastic, but it's supposed to be really good. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to it. I thought The Gunslinger was really good, so I'm probably going to really like it. Then that is followed by Misery. And the only reason I have this paperback is because Juan at Plagued by Visions sent it to me. Thanks again, Juan. And this has the awesome step back cover. I love that. That's so cool. Of romantic leading man, Stephen King there. I like the cover too. Stephen King books, the covers can suck because, like I said, nowadays it's just his name that sells the book. But this is the old edition, the old paperback edition. So yeah, it's cool. Misery, one of his best known books. We'll see if I love it or if it's misery to read. Now this next one I did read. I think I read this one in the early 90s. And I remember it sucking, or at least I thought it did at the time, and that is this one, The Tommyknockers. Now, my copy of The Tommyknockers is terrible. This copy of The Tommyknockers, I'm not sure what happened to it. It looks like it just was floating in a flooded basement for weeks. And that could very well be the case, but it is my only copy of The Tommyknockers, so I guess this is what I'm going to read. I'm hoping that I enjoy this more the second time. To tell you the honest truth, like many Stephen King books that I read when I was young, I don't remember a whole lot about it. Just general impressions, really. And my impression of this was that it wasn't very good and that it was too long. We'll see. Maybe I will feel completely different this time. Maybe I'll love The Tommyknockers. We'll see. Will I love this? I don't know. Tommyknockers, I'm going to read this beat to hell old paperback copy because that's what I've got. Then is an interesting one. This is Nightmares in the Sky, which is a book of photography, actually, all about gargoyles. The photographs were by F. Stop Fitzgerald, probably the dumbest name I've encountered in a long time, F. Stop Fitzgerald. I guess that's supposed to be artsy. I don't know. He's a photographer. He's an artiste. Anyway, he took a bunch of really cool photographs of gargoyles and he put them in this lovely book. And they are really cool photographs, I have to say. These are some good pictures. But Stephen King wrote some text in this. There's a long text piece in this book, which I assume is all about gargoyles. I don't know. I haven't read it. But I'm going to read it because I actually have a copy. And the only reason I have this copy is because my friend Justin gave it to me. Thank you, Justin, for giving me this book. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to read it. Following that is The Dark Half, a book I don't know anything about. I know they made a movie about this. I don't believe I don't know if I've ever even thought of reading this book. I don't remember anything about this. So this is The Dark Half. I do like this cover design. That's pretty cool. And I think with this, are we going into the 90s or was this his last book of the 80s? Yeah, copyright 1989. So this was probably the last book he wrote in the 80s. So with this, you know, the 80s are over. The 80s, which probably probably his greatest time as a writer. I mean, his books in the 1980s are pretty impressive. And so the 70s and 80s, that's probably the golden time for Stephen King. But this finishes off the 80s, the dark half. And then we get into 90s. I think this is 1990. I really, really don't like this cover. It's really Simple Simon and boring. But I got this out of a little free library, so, you know, beggars can't be choosers. I got this copy for free. This is 4 Past Midnight, which has 4 novellas in it. And I don't think I've read this before. I'm almost certain I didn't. Yeah, so this is copyright 1990. So we begin the 90s with this. We've got The Langoliers, Secret Window, Secret Garden, The Library Policeman, and The Sundog. No, I've never read any of those. So this will be a completely new experience for me. I don't know if this book is any good or not, but I'll probably like it because I've liked most of what Stephen King has written up to the point that I've read it. So we'll see. Will it suck? Will it be great? I don't know. It'll probably be a while before I get to this because, like I said, I'm reading a bunch of other stuff at the same time that I'm reading these Stephen King books. But these are the 10 that I'm going to read next. And that's all I have to say for today. That's all I have to say today. But I will be back. I will catch you next time.